Hello, world history classes. Today we are trying to take our first real set of notes about what is the study of history all about? What are the things that need to be on our mind when we're looking at our historical information? So I would like to remind you of a couple major points about note taking. By now, you have hopefully made a commitment on you are starting our semester using a paper spiral notebook, or you are starting the semester using my online template for notes. So whichever one you're doing should already be in front of you. If it's not, you need to pause this and get that in front of you to be able to start this up. So anytime you're doing any sort of notes with me, you want to make sure you have a date. So go ahead and write down on your notes the date at which you're doing this, or the date it was assigned. You also want to make sure each set of notes has a title. So this title, the study of history, is our main goal for today. I also want to remind you at the end of this notes, this is the same slide you've seen before, but at the end of these notes, you're only writing on one side of the page and you're leaving the other side of the page blank right now so you can ask some review questions, write a summary, and ask what you're still confused about on that page. So if you're using my template, same thing, we need to only write in the notes taking section so far. So from there, let's get started into the first dive into what is the study of history all about. And the first thing we consider when we talk about what is history, how reliable is the history that we study, we need to look at where our information comes from. And so for the vast majority of historical information, we have two main sources, two branches of historical study. So those two branches, we start with the first one of archaeologists. And you've probably heard of these before, and you probably have a rough idea of what they do. Just like you can see in the images here, they are going to the places where these historical civilizations were, and they are finding and studying artifacts. So if you didn't catch it, did you notice how I really slowed down and paced that little phrase? That should be one of those verbal cues for you, that if we don't know what archaeologists do, there's a little subpoint that says, hey, we need to know something about archaeologists. So archaeologists find and study artifacts. So then we ask, do we know what an artifact is? So anytime if you're hearing a word or a phrase that you don't understand, it is important that you make a note of that so we can follow through and make sure you know what we're talking about. In this case, we need to know that an artifact is like something that we can touch. So it's something that's actually there from that time period. And so archaeologists are going to go and they're going to go to those locations. They're going to try to find the things that were left behind. And things can also, in addition to like people think of shards of pottery or old weapons, they can also be bodies, they can be buildings. But the key is we're looking for actual things that we can like pick up and touch to be able to study and develop our understanding of history. So they work very closely with our other branch of history. And that's much more straightforward. We call them the historians. So historians gain information by reading. They read documents, they find old documents, and then they read them, they try to figure out what the story is that's underneath there. Now, it's not just reading, because if it's relatively recent events, they can also do interviews. And a historian who's studying an event that actually happened in the lifetime of someone who's still there can actually have that luxury of being able to ask questions to be able to dive deeper into that. Whereas if it's an event that happened more than a generation ago, we don't have that option anymore, and we just have to go off what was left behind. So just a quick notes check, since this is our first couple of slides. You should have written down, there are two branches of historical study. One is archaeologists, and they find and study artifacts. If you didn't know what an artifact was, you should have put an extra little note there saying, hey, that's something that they can touch, something they can pick up and interact with. So then you should have written down historians, and they get information by reading documents, and they can do interviews. So That's when we see those 2 bullet points, that's your sign, hey, there's 2 things we're looking for, and that's what we were trying to do. So then, as we've already discussed in class a little bit, I like us to think of history as a study of people, not just old dead things that don't really seem that interesting, but we're just dealing with people here. And you're a person, and you even have a history. In the 14 or 15 years that you have been around, you've already developed a history. And what I'd like you to think about for a second, if someone else had access to everything about you, your social media, your bedroom, your home, interviews with your family members, and anyone else who's close to you, would they ever be able to really capture everything that makes you who you are? And I hope as you think about that, you're going to realize there's a piece of you that no one else really knows. There's more to you than the stuff you leave behind and the relationships that you have. And so I like us to consider, when we're considering the study of history, we're still just studying people. And we're picking up the pieces they left behind, but that's not the whole story. And so as we all have a history, what someone else picks up from it will not be the whole story. So then what does this have to do with our class? As a world history class, it's really important to remember that we don't have all the pieces of the history we study. I'll repeat that again for us. We don't have all the pieces of the history we study. And that's going to be the theme of the rest of this discussion here is, if we don't have all the pieces, what are the weaknesses and how can we overcome those? So our major title has just changed now. So now we're looking at what are the weaknesses in the study of history. And the biggest weakness in the study of history is that we can only study what remains. People have left stuff behind, but we can only study what's left. So then information can be destroyed by a lot of different things. I would like to point out here, one of the great things about doing this through video is you can pause this. So if that first 3 lines is too much for you to be able to write down before I go on and start presenting the list, you can actually pause that and leave that on the screen and be able to catch up on those notes. So keep that in mind throughout. Feel free to pause if it seems like I'm going too fast. I typically go a lot slower when we're in person, but you don't have that pause button when we're in person, and you do here. So let's just go down a list of a few things that can destroy information. The first one that people think of a lot is natural disasters, environmental catastrophes. Those happen and they've destroyed information throughout all of history. Of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, many of them got destroyed by earthquakes, by other natural disasters. They are the Great Lighthouse is an example I like to use. So the very first lighthouse ever created, you have to go dive and you can see the remnants of it underwater now because an earthquake knocked it into the sea. So natural disasters can destroy information. Floods come, fires come, hurricanes come. All these things can take away valuable information that could have told us so much more about what happens in a civilization's history. In a similar but yet different area, weather can also destroy information. So we have natural disasters, but we also have weather. And weather is more of a long, slow process. So I'm going to switch away from this slide for just a second. I like to point out buildings like the Parthenon. You've probably seen images of the Parthenon today. If you haven't, feel free to just take a break and Google search that. If you see any of these old Greek buildings, they're all white. What we now know is they weren't white a long time ago. They had all kinds of brightly colored statues and buildings. But what happens is over the course of thousands of years, it rains a bunch of times. And each time it rains, a little bit of that paint gets washed off little by little until now we don't see any of the paint left. And the only reason we can tell it's colored is because there's chemical signatures of that paint that you can scrape off and be able to tell, well, this chemical is present in red paint, this chemical is present in yellow paint. And now we can tell, oh, they did have stuff, but the weather has just removed that. On a more personal basis, I've also had a student come up to me once who left their notebook. I think they were studying out in the backyard or something, and they left their notebook outside, and it rained, and the thing blew up about 5 times bigger than it was supposed to be, and their notes were now unusable. And so weather can destroy information both on a long-term scale or even just in a single event. Another thing to consider is war. War has happened throughout pretty much all of human history. And in the process, buildings get destroyed. Information gets destroyed on purpose. If you're writing bad stuff about your enemy, they are going to not want to be remembered by the bad stuff that you wrote about them. And so they might destroy some of it on purpose. Some of it's just if you're destroying a village to be able to go through and continue to make progress on your battlefield, that's gone forever also. The other two I feel like are relatively straightforward for us. Sometimes destroyed isn't the right word, but some information just gets lost. So there are plenty of documents and artifacts out there in history that we know existed, but we can't find them anymore. And we can go anywhere to, we know that a lot of documents were based off of a certain source. We know there are certain artworks, especially in like Renaissance Italy. Leonardo da Vinci has a famous artwork that we don't know what happened to it. And so we know it existed. There's all kinds of people writing about it, but the work itself is missing. And so there's lots of things that can just be lost. And on the same general trend of information there, information can also be destroyed by death. When someone dies, everything that they know that has not been recorded is gone. And so we can, if we look right now, we can still go find people that have served in World War II, be able to ask them questions, interact with them. What was their experience like? World War I, we can't do that anymore. It was too long ago, and all we have left is what's left behind. So we have our 5 things here. Your notes should also have 5 bullet points lined up, starting with natural disasters and then weather, war, loss, and death. As always, if there's an example that sticks with you, or there's something that I didn't say that seems to make sense to you that you know about, write that down here also. Those connections only help you remember even more in the future. So now we have this dilemma that sometimes we can only hear one side of an argument. Maybe one side got destroyed. Maybe one side got lost. But historians are left to have to figure out and make a judgment on what's left. And so it's important for us to know that historians use the information they have to create an image of the past. Once again, historians use the information they have to create an image of the past. And as we look at this, that's a really important thing for us to understand. History is what we have gone back and studied. We've looked at thousands of documents and dug up entire cities. And we have a plethora of information, but we're still having to write our own story on that using the information that we have. So what I would like us to consider again, from the analogy earlier in this video, does this give us a complete picture? Did we get a complete picture of you when we tried to figure out everything that makes you are just from your stuff and your relationships? And I hope the answer screaming at you is no. We do the best we can. And we're going to revisit this in just a moment. But we don't have that complete picture. We do the best we can with what we have, which is why history still changes. If someone finds a new archaeological site, if someone finds a new document, history is exciting field because sometimes we still find new evidence that's going to make us rethink what we've learned, what we've known about it in the past. Another quote to get us thinking about weaknesses in history. If you are a Call of Duty player, you've probably seen this before. This is a quote that I've seen in nearly every history professor I've ever met. We'll cite this at some point in a class, but history is written by the winners. If you are in a fight, you want your side to be heard. You probably don't want someone else's side to be heard. There's always two sides to a story. Sometimes we have both sides, but in the case of history, a lot of times we have very little about the civilization that got destroyed and a whole lot about the civilization that won. So we can start to ask ourselves about maybe civilizations that we have heard of. Have you heard of the Roman Empire? I'm guessing that the vast majority of you are saying, yes, we've heard of the Romans. But what about the Carthage Empire or the Carthaginian Empire? And generally when I ask that in class, there's a lot fewer hands that go up. These two were nearly equal. The Romans and the Carthaginians were nearly equal, but then they went to war. And through a series of 3 wars, Rome wiped out Carthage. And they told stories about the evils of Carthage. They created legends about how they destroyed the city, but we don't hear as much about them because since they got wiped out, their influence fades away. And so that's important for us to consider too. When we are reading about a conflict between civilizations, it's important to remember there's a side that's being heard less. So sometimes these can fit in with our last 2 examples here. 2 concepts that I ask you to look for a lot when we're looking at sources is bias. And if you've heard of bias, we consider that basically you're leaning one way or another in a story, or a one-sided version of a story. So we all have biases, and some people try to hide them more than others. Some people are influenced more by them than others. But we have biases, we have preferences. And when we're looking at historical documents, it's important for us to remember the person who wrote that document also has a bias. So whether it's a primary source or a secondary source, they can both show bias. So I like to give a couple of examples of sometimes there's bias that you don't even know is there. So I'd like to ask you, there's an image of a guy on your screen, and I'd like to ask you, what do you typically call him? And the general response when I ask this in class is people think of him and they say Eskimo. But Eskimo is actually a derogatory term, and a lot of people aren't aware of that, and you probably didn't mean anything by it if that's what you thought. This is a term that was created by the outsiders who looked down on these people. The correct term for these people is Inuit. So these people native to Alaska and Canada that spend a lot of time fishing and whaling, and because they spent a lot of time whaling, they were given the nickname blubber eaters by people who were being hostile towards them and wanted to insult them. And in that language, it was Eskimo. And so Eskimo is a derogatory term that means blubber eater. And of course, most people that use that aren't meaning it that way anymore. But there's times that those biases where you're using a term that you didn't even know was supposed to be a bad term can come out. Exaggeration is another thing that we see a lot of, especially in older examples of history, where you take something and you make it bigger than it really was. So the classic example we would see is the fisherman who caught a fish that's maybe this big, and they say they caught a 3-foot fish. And people do that because it makes them look better. There's lots of historical examples. The most well-known one that a lot of people are aware of is the story of the 300 Spartans. And the way the story initially was recorded was 300 Spartans were able to hold off an army of 1 million soldiers. Now we look back historically, that didn't happen. There were thousands of soldiers from all over Greece that were holding off this army, and the army couldn't have had more than 200,000 soldiers. But if we say, oh, there's 200,000 people versus 800,000, that's not quite as cool as saying 300 people stopped 1 million. And so it just makes things more interesting if you're telling the story, or it can make you look better or someone else look worse through exaggeration. And so we need to keep an eye out on all of these things as we're looking through historical sources, and we will look at historical sources a lot this year. And so one of the skills we're going to keep working on is, does this look like they exaggerated something? Does this look like there could be a bias when they wrote this down in this way? And what could that tell us about what the real story is if we have a source that's clearly biased? One more example, as I mentioned earlier, humans have biases. And I love this quote. It's from Sam Weinberg, who is one of the gurus of teaching world history. And he says, how we interpret the past shapes the reality we create in the present. So if we just stop there, how we look at the past creates what we see in our world now. And of course, our world now is going to create the world we see in the future. And so one of the examples I like to look at here is a long time ago, and we're talking roughly 400 BC, so 2,400 years ago. The civilizations in Greece started practicing democracy, where the people would get together and discuss what they thought should happen. And then they would vote for the events, and the governmental policies would happen strictly on what the people voted for. And we look back at that now and we're like, yes, that's what we base our government on. And then the Romans would do something similar to that, where the people would have a little bit of a say, and they would call that a republic. But then as time went on, people started to say, wait, you let the people have a say in the government? The people don't know what they're talking about. How can you let the people have a say in their government if the people don't know how to govern? And we had a long period of human history where letting the people have a say in the government was considered to just be dumb. But then in the 1700s, 1600s, we started to see some people start to question that. They looked back further and started to say, wait, no, the people should have a voice. And so we see that view changing. And so when we interpret the past differently, our reality becomes different. So we live in a world now that really values the people having a voice in the government, and that's moving forward. Democracy is spreading across the world, and this idea that the people need a say in their government. But it hasn't always been that way, and the world was very different when they looked back and they said, no, that was just dumb. And so as we change our views of the past, how we see our world now changes quite a bit also. So that concludes our study of history section of notes. So as we continue to move forward, I do want you to consider, even though there's weaknesses, all of these sources have so much information, or all of our, at the world history level in high school, there are thousands of sources, thousands of artifacts that have helped shape what we understand about our world now. And so this is by no means trying to discredit the field of history, but it's there to develop that extra critical thinking within us, that we need to question what we see, and we need to look for the biases, the exaggerations, the one-sided stories, or the stories that were not told in those events, so that we can really look critically at history and be able to get a better understanding of what really happened. So as we close out, I would like to remind you again, and this is the same thing we saw before, you should have a really good set of notes by now. You'll have several sections. They have bulleted points, and you have been indented along the way. What we need to work on now is the left side of this page. So as you start looking at looking back over your notes, what are some of the good questions that would be worth asking? Write those down right next to their answer. What are you still confused about? What questions do you still have? Those are going to go down here in your bottom left corner. And then take everything we've done today and write just 1 or 2 sentences that's going to encompass all of the big ideas of what you think this is really all about when we talk about how we should study history. As always, I want to help you all be as successful as we can. So if you have any questions, anything that you're concerned about or that didn't make sense, please ask. You know how to get in contact with me, and I will see you again in class soon.